I'm going to begin per request, the question I couldn't answer earlier by saying exactly what it is that Joan Halifax says about not knowing in her book, Being with Dying. There are several diverse comments on this that are scattered through the book. Starting in the introduction and the first couple of pages, she says, not knowing invites us to give up fixed ideas about others and ourselves and to open the spontaneous mind of the beginner. And then she says, a couple pages later, when self-conscious effort or unusual mental experiences arise in meditation, simply observe, accept, and let them go. Notice, relax, let go. The three key aspects of mindfulness. The mind of not knowing is simple, straightforward, open, and fresh. This kind of mind is like clouds in the sky, water flowing, a light wind, nothing obstructs it. And then she says, much later in the middle of the book, bring yourself to this place where you already are, your original dwelling place. A bigger view is available to you right now in the unfiltered experience of this very moment, an experience that is below the rippling of concepts and deeper than language. Just sit down and breathe. Take a moment to stabilize your mind, allowing your natural wisdom to arise. I promise you that you will see that nothing, including your own individual identity, exists in the absolute sense of unchanging permanent truth. And with our view of reality wide and clear, we discovered that the inexpressibly vast horizon of not knowing is shining in the dawn of silent surrender. And then she says, she's talking about narratives and how they can be helpful or harmful. And she says, our practice of not knowing points to an openness in perspective, an openness that is deeper than a story, deeper than our expectations, deeper than our wishes, deeper than our personality, and deeper than our cultural constructs. Okay, so I think that covers the things she said about it more accurately, really, than I did before when I was just paraphrasing. So you can see there's a lot of different things going on in there, some of which I think are useful for all of us in terms of not overvaluing our personal preferences about how we'd like things to be, what we'd like the schedule to be, so that we can work and practice and train together with others, and then realizing that some of our expectations and ideas and concepts that we can grasp on them too rigidly in a way that interferes with our ability to relate empathetically to the actual people who are around us. I mean, I think I may be talking about myself. Because, but then, some of the things she say actually sort of really apply or express the perspective of an innatist Buddhist, as we're saying, that basically the fundamental period of our wisdom that understands the emptiness of everything and liberates us is already here right now if we would just stop thinking. Like below the concepts, it's already right here, fully available, which is different from the constructivist approach, which is that we all have the potential for this, we have all the resources for it, but we have to use concepts, not just like discard them as our building blocks to get to a place where we can sort of launch into a non-conceptual understanding that nonetheless has accurate content that opposes the root of cyclic existence. Yeah, okay, that's one thing. So then this session I want to mainly talk about emptiness, try to take into account that a lot of what I've said this weekend, just coming out of my own experience of having studied Tsongkhapa system for a long time, and after a while starting to get some feel for it, And then coming up, as I described, against this situation where something that was coming from left field in relationship to that seemed very much on target. And so then working that through is really like just a personal thing that you've been invited to participate in, very self-centered in some sense. And it seems like accidentally it may be of some benefit in some ways to some people, but it's also not necessarily ideal if I had all my options available at the start, because not everybody has a clear picture of Tsongkhapa's system in their mind, so then instructing people how to not hold on to it too tightly isn't necessarily the most helpful if in the first place it is all kind of murky. Yeah. So anyway, I apologize. I would have done differently were I able, but it just seems like in this particular situation that's all I could do. So I'm just going to start on emptiness by reading a little tiny passage out of my book, Introduction to Emptiness, that is one of the better things that I think that I came up to express my way of describing what I've learned. And then I'll read a slightly more technical and precise passage about what exactly is ignorance that binds us here and that we're trying to overcome from Tsongkhapa. And then we'll go into talking more about how Jeffrey has been introducing this to people from the start. Implicit in cliches such as every snowflake is unique, page 95 in Introduction to Emptiness. Implicit in cliches such as every snowflake is unique is a celebration of our own uniqueness as living beings. The problem is only that we believe, usually self-consciously, that our own uniqueness arises from an inner essence that is our private core. And to defend and aggrandize that core, we harm others. To nurture that core, we build up our greed. We act as though malicious anger were our protective father and craving our sustaining mother. No one can begin to measure how much pain and anguish this has caused. In fact, we are unique. Our uniqueness arises from our distinctive, ever-shifting, and infinite array of connections with other things. We are unique and important, but we do not own our uniqueness. We have no intrinsic core that could own it. We owe our uniqueness to all our conditions and to our emptiness, because without the open sky of emptiness, the rest of the world could not shine into and through us, and we could never be what we are, living beings making choices that matter. Okay, so try to wax a little bit poetic, but stay within the bounds of the J. Rinpoche system. But what it doesn't do is express in a very specific or technical way exactly what is this ignorance. It has something to do with failing to recognize just how interdependent we are with everything. We could get that much. But we depend on our causes and conditions. That seemed pretty implicit in what I was saying there. But that's commonly understood in many different types of Buddhism. And in Tsongkhapa's system, the crucial, subtlest kind of ignorance is one that holds on to the notion that we and things around us exist from their own side, independently of any relationship with a designating consciousness. And this is definitely one of the harder things to get used to, because it's not the same as Chittamatra saying that there's only mind, but it is saying that consciousness is playing some kind of crucial role in establishing things as what they are. So first I'll read you exactly what Tsongkhapa says about it, and then I'll say something about how my teachers in India brought it to life for me. On page 212 of the third volume of the Great Treatise, he's talking about really he's identified all the wrong views that everybody in Tibet have about what it is that we're trying to refute when we analyze emptiness. What is emptiness the lack of? And he goes through a long section of the book going through the wrong views, and then he says, okay, what is what's the right answer? And he says, In the case of reification by ignorance, there is, with regard to objects, whether they're persons or other phenomena, a conception that those phenomena have some ontological status, some way of existing in and of themselves without being posited through the force of an awareness. The referent object that is thus apprehended by an ignorant consciousness, the independent ontological status of those phenomena, is identified as a hypothetical self or intrinsic nature. Chandrakirti's commentary on his 400 says, the self that we're talking about here is that which exists essentially, intrinsically, autonomously, and without depending on another. And then Tsongkhapa comments on that. He says that these things are synonyms: essential existence, intrinsic existence, Jeffrey says inherent existence, autonomous existence, and not depending on another, without depending. That's something that could just exist without depending on another. And then he goes on to say, here in this context, without depending on another does not mean, as you might have got from Guy's snowflake riff, that depending on causes and conditions. That's a grosser kind of understanding. Instead, other refers to a subject that is a conventional consciousness. And something is said not to depend on another due to not being posited through the force of that conventional consciousness. So if something could just like be what it is independently from its own side without reference to any perspective that sees it as that, then that would be the kind of self that we're refuting. So this is like, okay, so that's hard to think about, but that's what the final thing is that Tsongkhapa is trying to say. And of course then he goes on to say that you have to use reason to realize this first before you can realize it non-conceptually, as we've been explaining before. So, there's lots of examples that are used to talk about that. Jeffrey, uses the example of the letter A up on a blackboard and how it's not the letter A from its own side, but we designate it as the letter A. And in the tradition, they talk about gods, ghosts, and humans going to the river, and the humans, by way of their karma, correctly see it as water, while the gods, by way of their karma, correctly see it as nectar at the same time, because it's correctly, conventionally, different things from the point of view of different beings. This is opposite to, or very different from, a kind of objective materialistic view. But it's not saying everything is just in your mind. It's saying nothing can exist from its own side except in dependence or in relationship to a perspective that constitutes it as that. Okay, so this is what Geshe Benji Takpa told me in India. He said, this table is not made out of atoms. And so that kind of like, I said, it's not, why aren't there atoms here? We know that there are atoms here. And he said, oh, there are atoms there. I said, well, and also there's a table, right? Yeah, there's a table. The table's not made out of atoms. As soon as we think that the table is constituted, that it comes into existence as table by virtue on its own side of possessing a certain collection of atoms, we've made exactly the mistake that Tsongkhapa is pointing at. And I was like, oh, that is so interesting, I can see my resistance to the claim that the table's not made out of atoms. I resist that, and that resistance is related to this kind of ignorance that Tsongkhapa is pointing at. Yeah, they're atoms, they're tables, but what constitutes the table as table has to do with us and our perspective on it and as a table. You can't just separate it from that. Okay. So I think at this point I'll go into mostly just reading a highly edited version of a couple of Dharma talks that Jeffrey has given to introduce people to these ideas, which I just sort of went to the end of. I jumped ahead and say, well, this is what we're going to be trying to explain now, and it's like, well, how do we start to think about that? So Jeffrey says, and emptiness means that things appear to us to have a status, a manner of being that they don't have. By assenting to this false appearance, we are drawn into all kinds of problems. Our challenge is to figure out how to distinguish this false appearance from the things themselves. In other words, emptiness does not deny the existence of things. Rather, it's their lack of a certain kind of status that entails the falseness of a certain way that they appear. It's not that we simply imagine or suppose that things have this false status, because even in our raw sensation, before we stop to think, things already appear to have this false status. That is, at the sensory processing level, things are pulled together and seem to have some objective reality as something before So this is like a very important point, because it says, like, all these people say, well, just get back to your raw sensations and stop thinking. At least according to Chandrakirti, you'll be getting back to something that still includes the false appearance of things as having some objective reality. So he says, because even in raw sensation, before we stop to think, things already have this false status, this makes our challenge particularly hard. Just to follow that out, like, if things are already appearing to us, suppose things weren't if things appear just as they actually are to our senses, and our concepts were just, messing things up, then you could see this approach of just stop thinking, get in touch with your raw sensations, because that's what sees what's real, right? But even at the level of sensation, there's already a sense of things as having some objective existence apart from ourselves. That things appear that way, that they sound that way. Yeah, right, and so forth. Then we have this problem. It's like, how are we going to attack this problem? If we get in touch with our senses, stop our thinking, we won't have any vantage point for critiquing or undermining or attacking this false appearance. So what Tsongkhapa is saying is, like, okay, even though concepts always have this factor of wrongness, we have to, at the level of logic and analysis, develop an understanding that critiques our false idea, conceptually, our false conception that things have this objective existence. And it's going to be a long, long time before we overcome the sensory level, right? Even the pure ground, Aryas, when they're not in meditation on emptiness, they still have this, appearance of things, but they don't even for a second give any credence to it. But things still appear to them as though they're set up from their own side. They just ignore it, like I ignore the man who keeps appearing in my bathroom mirror. It's because it's obviously not a person. I don't even think for a second that it's a person. And so then, like that, you can, but it really does look like one, right? And so like that, you could get to a point where you still have the sensory appearance that things are out there apart from us, but you're so thoroughly convinced, like me in relationship to mirror images, that it's false, that you don't even bother to wonder. Right? You already know that it's a false appearance. So you can get to that point before you're a Buddha. Yeah. So Jeffrey says, well, let's start thinking about situations where we make up some kind of extra status for things that's just patently false. Like, say, the superiority of a certain race. The notion of racial superiority is not something that comes to you just naturally. Someone teaches it to you, or possibly you might dream it up one day. Then your mind gets trained so that whenever you see someone that you identify as being of another race, you already see that person as bad before you think. You get trained in this way to the point where this just works automatically, but it is built on previous reflection, habituation to this way of seeing things. But think about some ideas that we've been trained in for a long period of time and then had to get over by systematically opposing. When I grew up in the 40s and 50s, the Russians were all bad. I used to wonder about just how they could be such monstrous people. Did they have some natural defilement in their character? I struggled with this seriously, and I never figured it out. But when you're very well trained in this idea, even when you wonder about it, how it could be so, you still strongly feel that it must be so. Some other people may train in the idea that fat people are lazy. To be a good person, you have to be thin and muscular. Not just thin, but very thin. Otherwise, inadequate, lazy. This idea is inculcated, and then this idea creates terrible suffering. I'm splashing on Karen Armstrong. So, Karen Carpenter. So likewise, some people feel strongly that everyone who has lots of money is necessarily better off than those who don't. This is an idea in which we're deeply trained, and it creates trouble for us because it leads us to pursue money single-mindedly, because we take it for granted that acquiring money will make us happy like those other people who have more that we think are happy. And then with advertising, we get trained to feel that if we could use our money to buy certain things, then we would be really happy. And mysteriously, even when we are able to buy these things, this happiness is never quite reached. And so we start to feel really bad and go out to shop some more. So, also, and this is where he's sneaking around to, we really think that independence is good and dependence is bad. This is a very strong idea in American culture, which then makes it very hard for us to recognize our dependence. But dependence is clearly a fact of our lives, a fact that's crucial both for exploring emptiness and for relating with other people. In Santa Barbara, when the Dalai Lama was lecturing in a large hall, I was standing next to him waiting to translate. We were standing on a very, very shaky platform. And I was thinking, this thing's going to fall right over. But right then, His Holiness was talking about dependence, and he mentioned his own fame as an example of something that's dependently arisen. He said, it's just to reporters and so forth. Of course, I have a sense from my own side of His Holiness is just naturally famous. But he isn't naturally famous, just as the platform is not naturally stable. His fame depends on many, many things, including our networks of communication. Another professor I know gave a talk about how we don't own our own language. This is a man who orates a great deal in a very distinctive way, and I think of him as someone who is precisely characterized by his own distinctive voice and language. But of course that cannot be the case because language is a group thing. Someone has to teach it to you. If you independently speak your private language, then no one understands you. When Tara Tulku came to visit Virginia, he said that in affluent cultures generally, people tend to have a strong sense of independence because, like, if you don't give me lunch, I still have plenty of money to go get it somewhere else. It's no problem. We're not out begging for our next meal. But when you're begging, you're forced to see that you have a very close dependence on others, which everybody else has as well, but doesn't notice. I personally, Jeffrey, have a very vivid sense of independence about my house. It's very nicely set up. It's not pretty, but it has all the conveniences. And I feel that I can, in some sense, be independent right there. And of course, this is wrong. The fact is that I am constantly going out to buy more food. Thousands of people have contributed to the growing, packaging, and transportation of every item in the house. But as Tara Tulku says, affluence gives me a false sense of independence. The money makes me feel so independent. The money that makes me feel so independent actually depends on others in so many ways, like the very existence of this money. When you think about what money is and what it means to, quote, have money, there's so many factors involved that it just goes on endlessly to the point where you can't even think about it, or you don't want to. It feels easier to just stop right here with me. I've got money, I'm independent. But when you think about dependence, it just keeps going and going. Nevertheless, dependence is the way that things actually are, and so we have to think about it. As with me in my house, in affluent cultures, we feel a false sense of independence and entitlement. We cherish ourselves with a sense of pride in our supposed independence, and then when things don't go well, we're shocked, as though someone has struck us in the chest. We have such a great sense of self-pity, and we whine. But if from the outset, you're instead in a situation where you're forced to beg and scrape by, then you have a greater, more realistic sense of your dependence and a chance to lessen your sense of self-cherishing and self-pity. Even though you're scrounging for a living, your sense of self-pity may be less because you always know and cannot help but know how dependent you are. So in this case, our affluence can lead to a false sense of independence, which leads to more self-cherishing, which leads to more self-pity, and leads to more suffering. In a different sense, it's good to want to be independent, to make decisions. I don't want to be helpless. I don't want to be in prison. I want to be free to decide how to be free to decide to figure out what reality is. We need will, and the whole idea of karma is based on will, choices, intentions. To attain awakening, we need tremendous will, incredible determination. But does this have to do with a false sense of independence? Personally, I think that a great deal of my own will, which is rather strong, is based on a false sense of independence. So as I undermine that sense of independence, perhaps I am also undermining the false basis for how my will is functioning right now. There are dangers in working with emptiness, and for some people it might not be helpful at this point. But how is it that we have the will to study emptiness? Where could it come from? It arises in dependence on causes and conditions. It is not some natural essence of who I am in my own right. Similarly, I want what we call economic independence. But I do not want a false, exaggerated sense of economic independence. My so-called economic independence, by which I mean having something to live on, comes only in dependence upon millions of other people in their situation, and I want to understand that to the fullest extent. Of course, we have lots of things, but is that always a problem? We want lots of things, but is that always a problem? There's afflictive desire, but the desire for enlightenment, the desire to see things as they are, does not have to be afflictive. It doesn't have to be a problem. It can be afflictive when you don't have clearly in mind what awakening is. Perhaps you might think awakening will make me a very unusual, special, powerful person. If I were awakened, then people would really pay attention to me. So I want that. I'm quite sure that I, Jeffrey, really have some sense like that. I was the fourth boy in a family of only boys, and I was the littlest one. And I grew up feeling very small. But if I were awakened, people would certainly pay attention to me. This sort of desire for awakening is afflictive desire. And we also have anger, hatred, enmity, jealousy, so many types of afflictions. We have verbal spitefulness, and a sense of really needing to say something nasty about another person. I like that line. It's like this pressure I was talking about with the flowers, like very hard to bite it. And what is that mind that operates between the time you first feel the need to say something really nasty up through the time when you feel the need to hit someone? It's as if a different, even a harsher light were switched on in the mind, and the whole mind becomes full of that light, full of this very powerful impulse to lash out. What is the basis of these afflictions? They're based on and driven by an assent to the false appearance, to a status of things that things do not actually have. The other afflictions are powered by this underlying delusion. So one way to get at this basic assent, to recognize it, is to look at the way it flowers in each of the afflictions. Sometimes we might have a flash of anger. Other times we might have a simmering anger that we hold on to for a long period of time. And then when you hear a certain person's name mentioned, before you know it, you have already felt that dirty son of a bitch. Sometimes you simply cannot stand to see someone else's prosperity, or to consider someone else's good qualities, such as their education, their wealth, or their youth. For example, there's some older people who cannot stand youth. They feel, those terrible young people, they don't know anything these days. There is a sense that they are really wishing that everyone could be old and decrepit like them. It's complicated, though, because as you get older, then you realize just how stupid you were when you were young. Particularly insofar as the young people tend to feel that they will remain young forever, which is so stupid. This way that older people can look at the younger people and see them simply as stupid. Simply as stupid. Instead of saying, what a fool I was, an older person might sometimes look around at other people who are younger and say, you fools. So the young have a sense of arrogance about their health and their supposed immortality, while the old are beset with jealousy. Could we instead take delight in things that are going well for others? Could we honestly think, wow, that person is young and healthy, that is so great for them, I wish I were like that? Or, wow, those Rockefellers have such an awful lot of money, it is so fantastic, I hope their wealth will increase. Afflictive desire involves not wanting to separate from the object. You just want it again and again. Nowadays, for me, it's frozen yogurt and a few other things. Anger, on the other hand, involves a wish to separate from the object in any sort of violent way. Can we consider that these afflictive emotions are actually based on something false? Just consider the possibility. Consider that we see in ourselves and in others and everything else around us a certain status that these people and things don't actually have. And then we're driven by powerful emotions that rise from this delusion about how things exist. Now, if that is the case, then all of our problems come only from this delusion and not from the way that things and people actually are. Can we imagine a world in which we exist and other people exist and objects exist, and yet a certain imagined status is removed such that we no longer have these kinds of afflictive emotions at all? This is what's at stake. The next little section is about distinguishing between innate afflictions and those that arise as a result of training. And I'm just going to skip a few paragraphs and go to the end of that section. This Buddhist system claims that we innately see an independent status in objects. And this brings about all of our problems. And this can be pretty tough to accept. We can readily admit that certain kinds of suffering come from our own silly ideas. But can we really believe that all of our problems and all of the world's distress of all sorts is finally rooted in a single mistaken idea? I think it would be pretty simple-minded just to say, yeah, let me sign my name up to that. This isn't an easy thing to decide. But at least we can start by being clear that in this system, that is the claim. So let's put that in mind and then go to work investigating this perspective about an extra status in things and find out for ourselves how much suffering might be removed when we see things as they are. The next little section is about how emptiness isn't nothing. Emptiness does not deny the existence of objects, but it certainly sounds as though it does. We might hear about it and think, wow, those Buddhists believe in emptiness, as if there would be then no objects at all. But this is wrong. Emptiness denies a certain status in objects, the extra status as independent that we innately add. But we associate that status so intimately with the objects themselves that when we negate that status, when we realize that objects don't have that status, it feels like we're denying the objects. We can become lost. We can feel unable to see anything at all. Self, other, compassion, awakening, desire, hatred. It's all empty, right? It can feel like those things don't exist anymore. So, it's very important to put this firmly in mind. The teaching is that emptiness does not deny the existence of objects. You have to pass through phases where the very existence of objects will seem to be challenged. So it's important to keep this phrase in mind. Otherwise, it's unsuitable to study emptiness because emptiness is hard to understand. But you can start by keeping these words in mind. Just admit that you don't understand emptiness and then work at coming to understand it. And as you do, remember to keep in mind the words, emptiness denies a certain status of objects, but it does not deny the existence of objects. It's profoundly important to remember that there is a compatibility between emptiness and existence. In fact, without emptiness, existence is impossible. But wow, this is the very opposite of what people think that emptiness is. It sounds crazy, like saying that no existence is what makes existence possible. Maybe it's Zen. But what if we said that dependence makes the very existence of things possible, while independence would make the existence of things impossible? That might sound more plausible. Emptiness is compatible with dependence, dependent arising of things. Emptiness, the absence of inherent existence, is what makes change possible. Change means the arising of things dependent upon causes and conditions, and things also exist in dependence on their parts. If things had inherent existence, they really would exist independently. They would not depend on parts, and they wouldn't change. Thus, emptiness makes change possible, and it fits together with dependent arising. But some people are really attracted to emptiness because they want to deny their own existence. I might feel that I could escape from my apparently intractable lust for frozen yogurt by denying that I have it, or that the yogurt exists. Instead, I will just get attracted to Buddhism and focus all that lust energy on the idea of having no self. Emptiness, that is so fantastic. Now I don't exist, I have no problems. So the doctrine of emptiness can become in this way just another object to grasp with the mind. The actual realization of emptiness is dynamic. The emptiness of the mind is our Buddha nature. This is what allows for transformation, because this is what allows for change. It is that which, when perceived, makes radical transformation possible. Nonetheless, the word emptiness seems to deny functionality or effectiveness. It is a very powerful word, but it does not deny functionality. It does not deny existence. It does not deny effectiveness. It does not deny transformation. In fact, it's the key that makes all these things possible. If that's the case, then why don't they use a better word? Why do Buddhists have to use such a negative word? My students have asked this of me before. Why couldn't they just call it fullness, and then we would be happy? But Jeffrey says, its negative sense denies a status of phenomena with which we are very, very familiar, and upon which so much of our life, so much of our affliction and misery is built. It's negative because it denies a status that we are confusing with the object itself. So a very strong word is needed. So we can see the middle way. Emptiness denies a very important status of things, does not deny their existence or their ability to function, but it does deny a status that we see as being right there with the existence and the functionality of things. It's as though mixed up with it. It's very complicated. To us, independent or inherent existence seems just the same as existence. So when we begin to experience something about emptiness, it feels like the object is starting to disappear. This is because at that point we can't see the compatibility between the existence of the object and its lack of having any way of existing in its own right. The process of realization is a rocky road. You have to pass through extremes, wrong views that exaggerate and deny too much to arrive at the view in the center. Zeroing in on the center requires much more than getting the words straight. But you have to get the words straight, or else what happens in experience is that as you start to make a little progress towards emptiness, and then you veer to the extreme of nihilism. So then you can start reflecting a little bit about how things certainly do arise and function instead of just stopping. You can veer back to the extreme of inherent existence. Oh, these things are real, they're working. So you start to feel that things exist in their own right. So in this situation, the words of the teaching about emptiness are like a compass to guide you from avoiding the two extremes, or maybe a landmark. They show us which extreme view might be starting to take hold in our mind. In practice, you have to study and yet still be ready to find yourself going back and forth between these extremes for a while before things come together. It's said that when you directly realize emptiness in yogic attainment, all you perceive is an utter vacuity. You don't perceive some combination of the object and its emptiness, because only a Buddha can directly perceive emptiness and also at the same time perceive conventional things. Our minds are such that perceiving tables and chairs blocks us from directly experiencing emptiness, while perceiving emptiness will block us from seeing tables and chairs. So in this sense, our minds are going to be in some kind of situation of extremism for a very long time. I never thought of it like that. Let's seesawing back between seeing ultimate reality and its appearance as real, and then realizing emptiness, and then these things vanish and seem not to be here at all, and then going back to the false appearance of things existing from their own side, even though you remember that that's not true, but it still looks like it. And then going back to meditating on emptiness, where you don't see any tables and chairs again, and it's like, in some sense, not technically, but in some sense, that's like swinging between the two extremes, right? Even when you found the view, subjectively, moment by moment, you're alternating between states of mind which would guide you, if taken in isolation, toward an extreme. That's the first time I ever thought about when I read this. So when you look into the nature of phenomenon, seeking to find out whether it can withstand the type of analysis you're going to do, you're going to find out that it really can't withstand that analysis. And then it becomes difficult to posit the object. It becomes difficult to say how it could be anything at all. You may feel, if this sort of wisdom consciousness cannot find an object, then how can I reasonably say that it exists? A lot of people feel that. It's discussed in Lemmer and Shimon. So we have to face these problems and work through them. As we proceed, it's crucial always to remember that there is a deep compatibility between emptiness and existence, between emptiness and dependent arising, so that eventually the understanding of how one actually helps the other will arise in our mind. The key word here is eventually. Sometimes people say, there's no way that that's the teaching of the Buddha. The teaching is that everything is empty and therefore useless, or an illusion. If you feel that, perhaps you shouldn't really be studying about emptiness. We have to at least accept that this is the proper teaching as transmitted in Tibetan Buddhism. By recognizing this and remembering this, what the teaching says, the words of it, then we have a check against things that are potentially dangerous. When you start to feel, oh, I'm feeling nihilistic, then you know how to correct yourself. But emptiness is a negative, not just a negative sounding word. It is a negative. It is not even just a negation. In 1972, I was translating for the Dalai Lama, and I said, translating what he had said in Tibetan, in English I said, emptiness is a negation. And he immediately corrected me, saying, emptiness is a negative, meaning an absence. It is not a negation in the sense that it's not an act or process of making something absence. It is an absence. So suppose someone thinks that this microphone is an amazing microphone worth $10,000, and they feel, hey, that's the microphone I want to get. But actually, it isn't really a good microphone at all. It's just a cheap one. It's being this very special microphone is absent here. And no matter how much I imagine it on that status, and then on the basis of that grasp after it, and then fight other people to get it, and no matter how many other people came in and joined in this idea that, oh yeah, that's the super valuable microphone, it would still have an absence of being that $10,000 microphone. It just has that absence. So like that, no matter how many of us, how strongly or for how long we imagine that things just exist on their own in their own right, they actually have an absence of existing in that way. Which is different from some things, like we can sometimes, use our minds to imagine what we would like to have come about and create predispositions, that direct our actions and help for things to move in that direction. But if something is absolutely impossible and self-contradictory, then even with everybody thinking about it for beginningless time and wholly strongly believing in it, it can't come about, right? Because it's contrary to anything. It's self-contradictory and impossible. Every phenomenon has an emptiness, a lack of inherent existence, but we don't pay attention to it. In fact, we're constantly imagining the opposite and thinking that things exist in our own right. Unfortunately, as I've said, things appear to us to have this independent nature. We don't have to make it up or train in it. We're just born seeing that things this way. So there's these two problems: a false appearance that things are existing from their own side, and an innate agreement or assent to it. Right. So emptiness is just not the lack in general. It's the lack of a particular kind of extra status that we're talking about, that we falsely imagined. It's also true that the microphone's not an elephant. It has a total absence of being an elephant. And so that sense we can just go on positing many emptinesses. The emptinesses, the microphone's lack of being an elephant, the microphone's emptiness of being a $10,000 microphone. But no one in here really thinks that the microphone is an elephant, and no one gets into trouble and fights each other because they have that particular idea. No one runs out of the room because they thought there was an elephant on my head. So, on the other hand, thinking that the microphone exists from its own side, apart from our perspective, just independently on its own, and assenting to its appearance this way, this is something that actually does create problems and is so very important. Yeah, so that's why this particular lack becomes important for us to focus on in terms of the path. So we have to be clear about what we're saying. When we speak of emptiness, we want to know, and here he introduces the technical term, what is the, quote, object of negation? Which means, what is it that's being negated? The object of negation means that of which something is empty. In the case of the microphone's emptiness of being a $10,000 microphone, the object of negation is a $10,000 microphone, which is completely absent here, right? If we speak of the profound emptiness, though, the emptiness of inherent existence of the microphone, then in that case the object of negation is the microphone's inherent existence. The microphone itself is not negated. Microphone is called the basis of negation, and the object of negation is its inherent existence. So then he explains that to have an actual emptiness, the profound emptiness that liberates us, it has to have a basis of negation that's something that exists. This is a really interesting point. So when you say that the horns of a rabbit don't inherently exist, oh yeah, we've already realized emptiness of inherent existence because we can realize it in relationship to the horns of a rabbit. Because we can realize the horns of a rabbit don't exist, and since it doesn't exist at all, it certainly doesn't exist in and of itself. So we've realized the emptiness of inherent existence. All right, we're done. Yeah, but no, why it's not the profound emptiness? Because, and this is like an interesting point, you know, it's like the profound emptiness of inherent existence is that things that exist lack inherent existence. And when you remember that, it's like, so as soon as we're talking about the profound emptiness, we're already talking about this, a property of something that exists. It can't cancel out the very existence of things because the profound emptiness is only applicable and only relative to some existing things. It's meaningless to talk about it in relationship to things that it's trivial to talk about it in terms of things that don't exist at all in the first place. Suppose we consider the emptiness of Jeffrey Hopkins. Jeffrey Hopkins has to exist in order for there to be a profound emptiness of Jeffrey Hopkins. In this case, the object of negation is not Jeffrey Hopkins. It's the inherent existence of Jeffrey Hopkins. So we can learn pretty easily to use words to separate these two things. There's Jeffrey Hopkins, which is called the basis of negation, or sometimes the basis of emptiness, dongshi, and the inherent existence of Jeffrey Hopkins, which is called the object of negation. So now we've gotten the words right. Unfortunately, we have no idea what they mean. We don't really understand the difference between the existence of something and the inherent existence of something. And that's why there's an old saying that a little Dharma can be very dangerous. You get these words straight, and then you might think that you know how easy the Dharma is. Now, it is very important to get the words straight, but that doesn't mean that you understand them. So when something appears to exist, the appearance of the object and the appearance of the object's inherent existence are so mixed together that we cannot tell the difference. And what we're seeking to do is to learn to tell the difference, not just in words like we did, but in actual experience. And only then can we separate what's realistic and what's delusory in the way we see the world. Prior to learning this, we just separate them with words, and then we set out to have some sort of preliminary experience of what these words might mean. So the object of negation means the object that is negated is inherent existence. The basis of negation has to be some existent phenomenon, such as a microphone or a person. Everything that exists is the basis of an emptiness. Does that mean that everything is an emptiness? No, of course not. Emptiness, again, is just the absence of inherent existence with respect to an existent basis. So when Buddhists talk about selflessness or no self, the term self refers to the object of negation, to inherent existence. In Buddhism, one of the meanings sometimes of the word self is just person in an ordinary conventional sense. But here, when we talk about selflessness, self doesn't mean person. So we can speak of the selflessness of persons and the selflessness of other phenomena, because the object that's being negated, that is the self, or is inherent existence. And the basis of negation can be the person or some other phenomenon. So, since that was the end of that part of the talk, he says, as we study emptiness, it's important to engage in other practices that open up the mind and not just do this. It's good to relate our study to countless beings by setting our motivation at the beginning and dedicating at the end of each session. And at the end, we dedicate the value of the session to all beings. So whatever we've done so far, whatever progress we may have made in getting straight some of the terminology and perspective on the study of emptiness, may it go to the benefit of all beings. But it is not enough to just think vaguely of all other beings. Think, whatever benefit I may have gained, may it help each person in this room, including the ones that I might not like, and so forth, right? If we, all of us here, dedicate this value to each other, one another, here and now, then every person's work will help every other person. Then expand your thought and include the animals nearby. Then include the neighbors and people that you can think of at your workplace. Think of specific co-workers. Maybe this will help them. This can be very magical and increases the force of our understanding. Okay. So, now I'm going to do the second talk. I like that one. But this one that one's called independence, or dependence. It's called independence. This one's called designation. It's a little bit shorter. And it gets to the point that I was making earlier, that it's not just about dependence on parts and wholes and thinking we're independent of that, or dependence on causes and conditions and then falsely imagining we're apart from that. That the subtle ignorance is one that imagines things as having some way of being from their own side apart from being designated in the perspective of a conventional consciousness. So, yeah, now he's going to explain this in ordinary talk. Very interesting. Okay. Because they exist but have no independent status, it is said that things exist just by way of being designated to a basis of designation. So this is a key idea in Buddhism. We start by not understanding it, but it's important to try to understand it. To see what emptiness is about and to see how it is that things exist when they're empty, we're going to have to understand this. For each and everything that exists, there is a basis of designation and an object designated. What are they and how do they relate? In the case of a table, the table itself is the object designated. You could say that it is imputed or ascribed or designated in relationship to a basis of designation. For example, the collection of table parts, the top and the four legs. The object designated is not the word table, it's the table. For a large house, we could say that the basis of designation is the wall, the roof, the floors, and 17 rooms. There's a fan. We could say that it is designated in relationship to its 4 blades, or however many that is, and metal housing. The rug is designated in relationship to fibers, many fibers that are woven together in a certain way, not just a whole bunch of fibers in a pile. So what about a person? You could say that for a person, he doesn't state this directly, he says, you could say that the basis of designation is the shape of the human body. But then if we had a dead body here, then we would not actually designate that a person. So we could try saying that the person is designated in relationship to the body and the stream of consciousness. And the body itself is not existing independently, but it's also an object designated. What is the basis of designation? Well, it's designated in relationship to skin, bones, blood, internal organs, and so forth. What about a book? If a book if it has 510 pages, then those pages must be part of the basis of designation. We could point to each page one after another, say, is this one the book? Is this the book? Is this the book? And the answer is always no. Now the book has some information, but is this particular page the book? No. Is this other page the book? No. After a while, it makes you want to squirm because you know the book is there, but the closer you look, the less clear it becomes. We want something specific to point out, something we can grab, and we want to be able to say, this right here is the book. I can point to at any page, is this the book? Is this the book? Is this the book? Little children tend to ask these kinds of persistent questions, which can be irritating and boring. Take a dozen eggs. Is the third egg the dozen? No. It's a non-dozen. What about the fourth egg? Is that the dozen? No. You don't really want to face this question. You dismiss it and try to change the topic. Visualize these 12 eggs in front of you. Is the sixth egg the dozen? Is the seventh egg the dozen? Or is it a non-dozen? It's a non-dozen. You look at all of the eggs one by one, and each of them is a non-dozen. So, something that is not the dozen, doesn't include a dozen, is the basis of designation of the dozen. And this is disturbing. We really would rather not see it that way, not have people tell us these things. Because we feel that the dozen is right there when you look at it. How could you say that? So could you just say maybe then that all of them are the dozen? Well, each of them individually is a non-dozen, but all of them are the dozen together. But what's the difference then between saying that each of them and saying all of them? Each of them is not the dozen, but all of them suddenly are. What's the difference between each and all? It's really kind of a gesture. It's a designation that's put on top of the eggs, an imagining of something called all that goes out and covers all these non-dozens and somehow makes them into a dozen. Where is this all that is the dozen if each and every egg is a non-dozen? In Emptiness Yoga, Jeffrey talks about this, and he says that this was him. When he was the little irritating kid with the dozen. Yeah. Consider the body. The body is composed of a trunk and some limbs. Maybe you say a head also, unless you count the head as one of the limbs. Older Tibetans still think I while pointing to their chest, so they count the head as a limb. On the other hand, we tend to think of the head as the center of ourselves, and so it doesn't feel like a limb. So let's say for now that the body has 4 limbs and a head and a trunk. Is your left arm your body? Now you have to say yes or no. So you have to say no. Is your right arm your body? Now when you say is it your body, you mean your body that has 4 limbs, a head, and a trunk. Well, obviously right arm is not your body that has 4 limbs, a head, and a trunk. No. Is your left leg? Is your right leg? Is your head? What about your trunk? Is your trunk your body that has 4 limbs, a head, and a trunk? Well, because your trunk doesn't, have anything other than a trunk to it. If someone says, where is Guy? And you can just point at him. But what do we mean by him? We point at his body. We're referring to a person, but we're pointing out a body. We have a letter here. Actually, we do. Who's this letter for? We say, it's for him. And we point at the person's body. Beyond the end of the finger, we have a sense that he exists there covering a certain spot. Just exactly the way the dozen covers a certain area. When you think, my body, then you think that your body is fully covering a certain space. But clearly, the part that covers the top half of that space does not cover the bottom half. And this can be quite unsettling to continue to think about. Which, voice of experience here. I think he's describing himself again. So we feel an impulse to skip on to something else. Jeffrey one time told this story about people who believe that there are platonic forms, like ideal forms for everything that exists. And so someone is saying, well, that really doesn't make any sense. Tell me about the platonic hair, the platonic form for a nostril hair. And the Platonist says, when I think of that, my mind moves on to something else. it's like a record skipping. You know, it's like, yeah. Right. So I've tried to find that in the early dialogues, and I haven't tracked that one down yet. So it can be quite unsettling to say this, and we want to move on to something else. For example, if we had a hot dog for lunch, then what's the basis of designation of the hot dog? Well, there's the left side of the hot dog, and there's the right side of the hot dog. The hot dog is 7 inches long. Is the right side of the hot dog 7 inches long? No. Is the left side 7 inches long? So we can't find the 7-inch long hot dog there among its bases of designation. And it's exactly the same with our own bodies as with the hot dog. Things seem to have a certain status that they do not actually have. They seem to have a certain solidity or concreteness. We could think of this as pointability. The door to this room really seems to cover a certain whole area. It would seem so unreasonable to say that it does not cover the space from top to bottom. So it's hard to open up the mental space to ask about the door's basis of designation. There's the front side of the door, the back side of the door, the bottom of the door, the top of the door, however we divide it mentally. And this quickly begins to disturb our assumptions. And when we ask, of each and everything we encounter, what's the basis of designation? What is the object designated? We call this kind of analysis madhyamaka, the middle way. It involves searching for the object designated among its bases of designation. And this counteracts our belief in this false status of things as concrete or independent or set up from their own side. In a way, it's like child's play. When I was young, a kid moved in next door and he would ask questions of this sort like, so is this page the book? No. Is this page the book? If madhyamakas are in effect pulling the wool over their own eyes, then it's going to be right here in this analysis. Suppose that they were telling us, in effect, that we misconceive books to be elephants. We look among the books to see if there's an elephant. Is this the elephant? No. What about this? No. After a while they say, now you have realized the emptiness of elephant in this book. So what? It's a trick, a shell game. I never said in the first place there was an elephant in the book. I never thought that. And like that, I never claimed that my right arm was my left arm. So what? I never said that the first page was the second page. I never claimed that the first page is the whole book. I never supposed that I could just rip out one page, hand that page to someone, and truthfully say, here's the book. So is this whole thing even relevant? This paragraph, I happen to know, reflects a specific viewpoint of one of Jeffrey's professors, Richard Robinson at the University of Wisconsin, who was fluent in Chinese and Sanskrit and wrote a great early book on Madhyamaka and wrote an article in which he specifically advocated the position. He used the phrase shell game, and he made this exact argument that Jeffrey has here in this paragraph. And then, unfortunately, he was killed when his furnace exploded, which is, I just thought I'd mention because I was like, and Joan Halifax tells a story about going on retreat, and then on retreat, there's one less person who leaves than there was who sat down at the beginning, right? So these kind of things happen. But anyway, it's not a shell game like that. When we point out our car in the driveway, we have a sense that it is something out there that we can point out. It's something that covers the whole space between the end of our beyond the end of our pointing finger. We don't hold that the back bumper is the front bumper. Maybe we do think, though, that there is some special entity out there that exists in both the back bumper and the front bumper. The car-ness. In any case, the car we worry about, the car we care about, the car we fight over, is the car that we can point out, the one that's at the end of our pointing finger. Being able to be pinned down and pointed out in this way would imply that the car does exist from its own side. We feel that it ought to be able to be pointed out because it has its own way of being out there in the driveway, apart from our thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah. The sum of the parts is, you think the sum of the parts is the thing? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Well, he's saying, what is this sum? When you say sum, he's saying, when we say the sum, It's like a whole bunch of things that are put together, and in our mind, we're constituting them as in a collection. And then we take that collection and constitute that collection as the basis of designation for a certain kind of name. Now there's lots of other things you can, that's what he's saying in here, that the all or the sum is just like, each part of the car is not the car, and when you have each, it goes through every single one. This is the argument he's making here. And so that's essentially another way of talking. What's the difference between each and every and all? This is just a difference, sort of a rhetorical trick, whereby we're going to now say that this is some other, independently existing thing that's there from its own side. But there's another way of thinking about it too, which he doesn't use here, which is to say, you can have a complete, like when you go to, say, Kmart and buy a bookshelf, then you don't get a bookshelf. You get a collection of bookshelf parts, hopefully complete, with instructions in Chinese. But it's really not a bookshelf, even though you have paid for a bookshelf and bought a bookshelf. So it's very clear in this case that a complete collection of parts in itself, right, doesn't constitute the object, right? So then you think, well, there has to be a certain shape there, right? But the shape, if you think, okay, the thing, the real thing of a car is the shape. The parts could be all strewn on the ground. It's not a car. Every individual part is not a car. But the shape of a car is the car. But then you still have a problem, right? Because there's all kinds of car-shaped things that are not cars that we can, construct with holographs or clay models or, I don't know what people, everything. So when you break it down and you think of exactly what is the car, like, this is the point His Holiness the Dalai Lama has talked about a lot. If there were really some objectively real car, I'm not saying that there isn't a car, but the car depends upon our having a convention that says when certain kind of things are arranged in a certain kind of way, and seem to be usually working, but we could have an unworking car too, right? So, right? They have broken down cars. Are they no longer cars? I can't fix that because it's not a car. I only fix cars. Could you turn it back into a car for me? I got all these non-car things here, and they need to be reconstituted. So that's a problem.
Maybe you can talk to my deal.
Yeah, it's a non-car. So anyway, right, you're thinking the right thoughts. You're going down the right alleys there, right? You have to worry about those things. So let's see. For example, when we look at this, some person we know, we strongly feel that from his own side, his very appearance is just shooting out like a radar, a radio, or a television, shooting out this clear message, guy, guy, guy. And we practice names in this way so that we feel that the person's name is just appearing from their side, not from ours. I definitely do not feel that I am designating this as guy. It's guy just already from the inside. And so when I see someone, Venerable Chodron, I don't feel like I'm designating that as Venerable Chodron. She's like Venerable Chodron from over on her side. Right? I'm just passive. I'm passive witness to this, radio signal of her nature coming out and with her name. So when I do this in class, when you write a letter and you point it out, you can say that the letter begins at the left side and ends at the right side. Or we could say that it starts at the top and goes to its bottom. If we take the letter A, for example, if you look at the set of shapes and not recognize this as being a letter A from its own side, then how will we be able to read? This is how it feels. If you're saying that a car isn't a car, how will we drive anywhere? If you're saying that an A isn't an A, then how will we be able to read anything? Right? But is the slanted line going up this way, the letter A? Is the slanted line going up the other way, the letter A? Is the crossbar going across like this, the letter A? Or is this crossbar a non-A? It's useful to look at each of these three shapes one at a time and decide not A, not A, not A. And then you begin to get a little sense of what it means to say everything's been subjectively designated. Nothing exists objectively from its own side. And it strongly seems to us as though that would be the case. The lines, of course, have to be arranged in a certain shape. Then, when they are arranged, we feel that all of them together are the A. But what is this all? It's just a word for the three parts, every one of which is not the A. When I was little, I would sit on my father's knee and grab a finger. And then I would say to him, "Is this your hand?" This really bothered him. I grew up and I'm still asking the same question. Still asking the same question. Okay. Trying to time this. All right. So, rope snake. Probably heard of the rope snake. Have you ever seen as a rope a snake? This is the most common example in Indian texts, and it's a very powerful example, but it's not something we often experience. He says often. I don't know. Has any of you ever mistaken a rope for a snake? Okay. I don't know. Well, what about mistaking a mannequin for a human? Or maybe once in a while we might mistake an image for an actual person if the mirror is very clean and we weren't expecting it to be there. Right? One time I was taking care of an old man and I found him in his house down on the rug scratching at the rug. And I went over to see what he was doing, and it was just a spot of sunlight. He was trying to scratch the sunlight off the rug, and I thought, this is so pathetic. Now, one day, though, I was visiting my parents, and I saw a spot on the rug, and I scratched at it. I couldn't get rid of it because it was sunlight. In any case, the traditional example of a rope being mistaken for a snake illustrates how things are posited through the force of ordinary innate conceptuality. When the light is dim, you see a certain coiled shape and the variegated colors of the rope, and you think, there's a snake. But the color of the rope is not the snake. Its parts are not the snake. The whole collection of rope parts is not a snake. In fact, there is nothing there at all that is a snake. It seems obvious, but you should go through the individual parts and really feel this example. Imagine that there's a piece of coiled rope right here, and it has some red strands and some yellow speckles. And then appreciate that every one of those strands individually is non-snake. And then appreciate that the whole collection is non-snake. In this case, the snake that is imagined right here, there is no snake that we can find. There's only a mere designation by conceptuality and dependence on a rope, which is not the suitable basis of designation for a snake. Now, like this, the thought I arises in relationship to the mind and body that are its basis of designation. But the mind is not the I. The body is not the I. The collection of the mind and body is not the I. The continuum over time of the mind or the body or the collection. None of these things is the actual I. Just as the collection of the rope strands is not a snake, none of these bases of designation with respect to which we have the thought I actually is the I. Nor is there in the least anything else separate from these of which we can say this is the I and point it out. Right now we perceive our own I as thoroughly blended with its bases of designation. We can't tell one from the other. When mind and body appear, this I appears right there with it. If they were somehow separate, we would probably conclude that one or the other of them didn't exist at all. When we look at the rope snake, there isn't some snake there that is a separate entity from the rope. It's just the rope that we've designated as a snake. So the key point is that just as there is no snake at all among the rope strand collection, there is no I that we can find and point out among the collection of mental and physical parts. The I is merely designated by the mind. When you understand this, it is truly stunning and is like hit by lightning. So this is like, His Holiness's book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. He talks about his own experience and uses a similar phrase. But this is not to say that the person, the I, is exactly like a rope snake. In the case of a rope snake, the rope is the basis of designation of the snake, but it's an improper basis of designation. The coiled parts of a rope are not a proper basis of designation for a snake. They're the proper basis of designation for a rope. So with regard to the rope, the snake doesn't even exist conventionally. On the other hand, there is a conventionally existent person, a mere I. So the example shows the unfindability of the object designated among its bases of designation. That's what the example shows. It does not go to the question of whether the object designated, the snake, actually exists or not. Someone else could come along with a flashlight and say, hey, there's no snake here at all, and they'd be right. But if someone claimed that the person is not here at all because the I can't be found among its bases of designation, they would be wrong. He uses the example of the word love, and he goes through each of the letters in the word love. And he says the L's not the word love, the O. He says, please don't ask me any more of those questions. And then he said, and then is the E the word love? Well, you might get a feeling after a while that the E really must be the word love, because it's the end of the word and there's nothing left. There's nothing else coming along later that we could point out. But this can't be right. Of course, we can say this hand is body. My hand is not the body that has a trunk, head, and limbs. But it is body. Take another example. We could ask about one slice of banana. Is this banana? Again, we say it is, but it's a different usage. One drop of milk is definitely milk, but it's not a gallon of milk. A slice of bread is bread, but it's not a loaf of bread. Likewise, one slice of banana is not the banana that is 8 inches long that we were looking for, and it's the same with all the other slices in the banana. So we can speak of the substance banana, not the object of banana, then the basis of designation is different. Similarly, if the object designated is space, if we're talking about how space exists, we have to be very careful what we mean. Are we talking about a certain area? The space or area in this room, for example, can be divided into parts. We can take each of those parts, we could take those parts together as the basis of designation for the whole space. We're running out of time. Okay, so partless particles. Can't go through partless particles in detail. Basically, points out that some Buddhists have a system where the solution to this problem is to say that, everything's made out of really tiny parts, and these really tiny parts exist in and of themselves, but the stuff that's made out of them is just like composite, built out of these fundamental building blocks, right? And then the problem comes if the particles are big enough to have parts themselves, then you haven't gotten down to the base. But if they don't have any parts, then they don't have any extension. As soon as they extend in space, the particle's this big, like 1 nanomicron, it's that big. Then it's the left half of the nanomicron and the right half of the nanomicron, and you're back where you started from. But suppose it doesn't have any extension at all. Then you pile up a whole bunch of them, and you still don't have any extension at all. You're not getting to the table. So you start thinking, gosh, it's not only that the table, isn't made out of atoms, it couldn't be made out of atoms, even if we had, what kind of atoms could that be made of? So, in physics, if you read, especially in the popular physics, you always hear about, now we've discovered what's inside the neutron, it's quarks. Oh, we've discovered what's inside the quark, the strings. And then it's like, so then people think that, we're now getting down to the reality, the smallest thing that all those other appearances are built out of. One time the Dalai Lama met with the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and Seibert was telling him about quarks, and the Dalai Lama said, do they have parts? And Seibert said, no. But then he thought about it, and he said, oh yeah, because you can drill a hole through one of them. So obviously, if you can smash something or drill a hole through it, then it has parts, even if you haven't broken it into those parts. It's the same with time, beginning, middle, and an end. So where is all this going? I have to skip a little. For each and everything that exists, there's a basis of designation and there's an object designated. And what we're going to do is search for the object designated among its bases of designation. We have a sense that the table, the chair, the bus, the house, the car, the body, and so forth are very solid things that are out there from their own side. They're objects that are designated, and so if they really are out there from their own side, we have to go out and look among their bases of designation to see whether they really exist in the solid way that they appear to us. And this is not easy. The structure of the search isn't so difficult to understand, but emotionally it is wrenching. Our stories about ourselves are built around afflictive emotions about people and things that we take to be very solid. Our minds and bodies appear to us in a certain way. Within that context, we are each born with a powerful sense of ourselves as persons who exist inherently from our own side. But that this inborn sense of ourselves as inherent, really real, doesn't have a specific idea about whether this real self is one with the mind and body or different from the mind and body. It doesn't think about that. It just says, oh, they're real self, and gets a hold of it. So it doesn't naturally occur to us to wonder, hey, am I one with my mind and body? Am I different from my mind and body? Are there any other possibilities? We don't actually have any reasons for believing in the here and existent self. It's just an ordinary, familiar sense to which we're habituated, thinking, I. When your stomach aches, you just say, I am sick. But are you your stomach? Well, we didn't think about that. If someone sticks a pin in your arm, you say, hey, you stuck me. But we don't think about whether you are or are not the same as your arm. But now, in this path, we're not going to be satisfied with how things ordinarily appear. We're going to investigate. And this analysis disrupts the very foundation of the world as we've known it. We've already started by dividing everything into bases of designation and object designated. For everything that comes to mind, instead of taking as it is given, ask, what's the basis of designation? It feels like that you're doubting an old friend, someone that you've been close to for a long time, and now you're starting to ask questions. What we're doing, what we're trying to do is overcome our assent to this exaggerated status. We're trying to overcome our own sense that there is some findable I, or findable table, or findable car. Of course, this means to overcome a certain kind of consciousness that believes in these findable things. But the way we overcome the consciousness is to search for the object that the consciousness believes in. It is not that you find that consciousness that believes in the findable car and then you suppress it. Stop thinking like that. It's not that. That would be hard. Instead, you just investigate things in much more detail. When you analyze the car and don't find it, then you will be convinced that there isn't any such thing as findable phenomenon. And this will stop the consciousness that believes in that. For example, we all know now that I crave frozen yogurt. And suppose I got it into my head that there's a frozen yogurt store over in Newport. I'm really anxious to finish this teaching so I can get right over there and get some. You could pat me on the head and tell me to calm down and send me back to my room. But while I'm sitting there, these thoughts of frozen yogurt will still be appearing in my mind. And how am I going to stop them? Perhaps it would help me to hear from some competent person, someone I trust, that there isn't any frozen yogurt store in Newport. I might believe that person, and on that basis stop obsessing about getting some. But on the other hand, I might say, oh, you're just pulling my leg. I'm very sure it's there. In that case, I would have to go over for myself, go through the village, looking in every store, no yogurt here, one store at a time, which would be exhaustive. That's the kind of work we have to do. It will not work to just learn this terminology and reflect a little bit. We have to study the great texts of the Madhyamaka tradition and think about what they're saying. The Dalai Lama says, think, over and over again. Perhaps we have turned to Buddhism because we thought we would get some rest from endless thought. And now we are faced with this. For inspiration, we can look at the images of Buddha in contemplation, and we could consider that he is thinking about the basis of designation and the object designated. And we could form the thought, I want to do that. Or it occurred to me when I read this, I could think, we might not want to posit that the Buddha is thinking, but we could posit the Buddha wouldn't be a Buddha unless he had been thinking, right? Those who are successful at this are not those who vainly set out to win public debates or score points in scholarly discourse. Yeah. That was like Jeffrey. It was like always trying to. It was like that's what scholars mostly do, right? And he didn't want to get sucked into that game, and so it was a bit of a challenge. You have to cultivate a strong wish to penetrate the nature of things. You have to develop intense love and compassion for other beings. You have to see that this kind of analysis is what will enable you to really help them. We help living beings in distress. even saving a bug from water, and we engage in an ethical life, and we practice patience, and we make effort, and we learn to focus our minds in meditation. And all of this helps open our minds up and strengthens them so that it's easier for us to do this analysis that will penetrate the nature of things. And then he says, again, let us dedicate any tiny merit that we've accumulated here to the welfare of all beings. And let us think of this merit as helping poor people and religious organizations that are dedicated to helping people. Okay, so, yeah, let's see, I have 5 minutes. I just want to say, like, okay, so that's why I got interested in Buddhism. Jeffrey would do this kind of stuff, not, not word for word, not his exact talk, but he would do this kind of stuff with graduate students while we were reading we'd be reading Nagarjuna, and he would like stop and think about like this, and then he would go into one of these riffs. And then even in undergraduate classes, he sometimes did this, maybe not as painstakingly, but people could get a taste of it. And that's what led me to continue to study Buddhism past the age of 20. Yeah. Okay, well, the other thing that I was going to do, which we don't have time to do, there's like something auspicious, right? Have you heard this in the tradition about not finishing? Because it creates like karmic connection for coming back together. Yeah. I was going to explain like what I think the distinctive things in Tsongkpa's teaching are that allow him to rescue Chandrakirti from the nihilism attributed to him by prior commentators. And as it happens, the Venerable Chodron has suggested that maybe that sort of thing would be a likely topic for a future visit. So, and it's also not that easy to explain, like in 4 minutes. So, I think it's best that you take one question and wrap it up. Or if there is none, we could just well, like the rabbi. You never know. The intention when I started this project, I have a whole bunch more of raw transcripts, and some of them are just from lots of different Dharma talks he's done, and that people have generously transcribed and Jeffrey has sent to me. But it's quite a mess. I mean, it's not. I mean, this is Jeffrey's voice, but it's like this other book is the Dalai Lama's voice. It's not like word for word what the Dalai Lama said. And so, there's so many things that I'm supposed to be doing. But I have said to people that of all the things I'm supposed to be doing that I'm not doing, this is one of the ones that has more like spontaneous appeal to my mind. But that doesn't necessarily, there's external pressures too, like you said you were going to do that. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah. But I call it, the working title is Playing with Fire. We'll see, maybe it'll come out someday. Yeah. Yeah, one question that's very simple to answer. No.
I don't have that question.
Oh, you don't? Maybe we should do it later then.
But I have a question that I always ask and I'm satisfied and I was thinking about the basis of
Oh, yeah. You go out into the forest.
Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knew it was there. Suddenly it's there.
Yeah.
Was it not every day?
Oh, no. I understand. This is, okay, this is a real, and then people say, what about the tree falling in the forest and so forth. Right. Okay, so yeah, and then what about the Big Bang, if we go with modern Western cosmology and so forth, was there somebody watching the Big Bang? And then the traditional, some lamas will just say, oh, well, the Buddha was watching everything and so forth. And it's like, right. Yeah, so this is something that I've thought about quite a bit, and I feel like I've gotten a little closer to having a way of answering it, which, let's just say this, not all of my teachers have the same answer to this question. You get different answers. But one answer that I'm sort of personally drawn to is to think about it in terms of, we aren't saying that they're not lots of different things that exist. But they don't exist as a Big Bang, as a tree, as a forest, as a reptile. Reptiles, how long have reptiles existed? Well, in some sense, there have always been some things that we properly now designate as reptiles. But they've only existed properly as reptiles retrospectively from the point of our saying, oh yes, there have been these beings and we will decide to call these ones reptiles and the other ones amphibians. So, you know what I'm saying? It's not that they weren't there before, but as...
To me that sounds different from saying a basis of designation and, if both of these things have to exist for there to exist. And what about the things, what about food that, food wasn't like in the Big Bang?
Well, I'm leaving the Buddha out of it for now. Okay. No, I don't know if I'm leaving the Buddha out for now as one of our observers. I mean, some lamas do give that answer, but I'm leaving it out for now. All right. So I'm saying more like this. When you think, oh yeah, but you're saying it's already like there's already reptiles there, and then what does it matter what we call them later on because they were already real before? Well, it's like this, like things. There's all kinds of things that exist in the world. Like if in the traditional thing, they're saying, well, gods go and humans go to the river. There's something there that they're not saying that everything is in the mind. There's something, but it's not water, it's not ambrosia, it's not pus and blood, it's not molten tin, it's not a burning desert, except insofar as it is that from a certain point of view. And it can be simultaneously all those things from different points of view, which goes to the point that it isn't anything naturally from its own side. Which is sort of like saying, well, I'm saying that there are things that exist, but we can't even, as soon as we can't even say anything about them or start to talk about them except from the point of view. Like from the point of view of a spider, how would this be? From the point of view of a hungry ghost, what would this be? And then they're all different kinds of things that are properly taken to be there, depending on what kind of mind is moving around in the world. This is what I say, but I'm not saying it like with the force. I have a teacher, I think this is what Geshe Tupke, who came here to visit, has told me about this. And also his friend, my teacher, Geshe Bendo Takpa. But I know from reading some other texts and talking to some other teachers that they don't like this interpretation. But I do.
I'm going to with that one. I'm going to with that one, but then look at it and go, no, you're wrong. And I'm going like, well, now I'm thinking.
Well, the thing is, the reason that we're wrong is because we think that when we hear that explanation, that it's leaving our sense of an objectively real world unscathed. But it's not. It's really not. That's why I started by saying this table is not made out of atoms. I mean, that's not unscathed. Everybody thinks that, right? The table is not made out of atoms. It's made in relationship to minds. It's constituted in relationship to our perspective. It doesn't have any objective existence. There's something. I'm not, but as soon as you say, oh, well, you're saying that the legs are real, but the table isn't. No, this is the same problem, right? And it keeps going. So there's it's almost like there isn't anything there except, insofar as we've designated, but it's not quite like that, right? There's nothing there that you can even think of or begin to categorize or talk about except in relationship to our perspective. So everything we know and everything we think about the world correctly, right, is only true in relationship to our particular perspective. That is very different from how people see things. Yeah. And that's what I think. That this is my interpretation based on a selection of, things that have been told to me by, two of my lamas. But I know that other teachers say that that's wrong. Yeah.
But it's a slippery slope kind of thing. Like I hold that for like 30 milliseconds and then I slide back into
Exactly. No, I know. Well, that's why I started. Because I know. Well, that is the way I'm taking it to be now. But you have to, if you understand that this all, go around and like look at everything and think about its bases of designation and how it's not findable there among its bases of designation, right? And how it's not made out of, it doesn't exist because it's made out of these little parts that are objectively real either, right? You undermine your sense that things are there apart from the mind that's designating them. Definitely. I know what you're saying, but you have to, if you work with these reasonings, it definitely cuts against our realism, you know. That's why I, you know, if you just say, oh yeah, things are they're just fine the way they are. You know, we categorize them this way. In China, they categorize them in this way. But you know, there's still all the same real things. It's not, you're not really getting it. Yeah. Yeah.
You're seeing a river of cups and you're seeing a river of nature.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's like that. When you go to different cultures, then you have this, you know, we've all probably done this like experience of like, this is so different, but then it's the same. No, but it's different. But it's so different. But it's the same, really. But then, you know, you go back and forth between these minds.